Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon and welcome to this discussion with the Indian High Commissioner, His Excellency Y K Sinha, about UK-India relations. India is currently the fastest growing country amongst the G20 and is slated to become the third largest economy by 2030. In fact, the name of India has come up on a number of the panels throughout the day today. So we're quite right to give it special focus. And it's also extremely timely. We've just had a visit by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to London last week for bilateral meetings with the UK government and also to attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And it'd be fair to say that the bilateral relationship with India has been a priority for British governments for at least the last 2 decades. And it's rooted in a shared history, common language, similar legal and institutional frameworks, and a large and successful diaspora of 1.6 million British Indians. In fact, we're so familiar with each other that a respected Indian businessman once said to me that our two nations are a bit like a long married couple. There is a risk of taking each other for granted, and so we sometimes need new sparks to revive the relationship. So, High Commissioner, did we see any of those new sparks last week? How did Prime Minister Modi's visit go from your perspective, and what concrete steps were achieved in taking the bilateral relationship forward?
Thank you, Lord Gadhia. I think the question of sparks, I think there's been this continuous series of sparks that we've had in our relationship, certainly since the last visit of the Prime Minister, the first visit of Prime Minister Modi in November 2015, followed by a visit by Prime Minister May to India in November 2016. So I think we've had this very sustained bilateral engagement, and this visit in many ways reviewed progress made earlier and launched new initiatives. The new initiatives that are particularly exciting from my point of view is this new, it's not new, the technology partnership has been there, but this new India-UK Tech Alliance with India-UK Tech Hub co-located at the British High Commission in Delhi. And I think a lot of initiatives under this head that is going to go forward, which clearly sort of illustrates the very broad-based, vibrant relationship that we share, cutting across various sectors, whether it's defense, security, cyber, agriculture, skill development, you name it, and there is some sort of collaboration or cooperation and happening bilaterally. But to sum up, I think this visit was particularly useful, came at a very useful time, because as the UK readies to leave the EU and looks for partners across the globe, India is one such partner, the fastest growing large economy in the world, and India itself is looking for partners across the globe. So I think both our countries are democracies. We share a common legal system and a common language, certainly, but also I think there is a lot we can do together because of the complementarities in our economies. So I think this visit in many ways has set the tone for the future relationship.
Thank you. And of course, the Prime Minister was also here for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and of the 2.4 billion people that represent the 53 Commonwealth nations, India represents more than half and is, alongside the UK, the joint largest economy, contributing significantly to the sort of $10 trillion Commonwealth economy, if I can call it that. How does, I mean, India has had, sometimes people have felt it's had an ambivalent attitude towards the Commonwealth. how would you characterize the engagement of India with the Commonwealth following last week's meetings?
I think it's often been pointed out that the Indian Prime Minister has attended CHOGM after 2009. The last time that the Indian Prime Minister attended a CHOGM was at, if I remember correctly, Trinidad and Tobago in 2009. But I think his participation in this CHOGM in the UK, in London and Windsor, clearly signals our desire to engage with member states in the Commonwealth and to step up our own participation, whether in terms of contributing towards the common goals of the Commonwealth or the objectives that are being that were laid down, the goals that were laid down in the current CHOGM. So we've been actively participating in, for instance, the executive sessions at the retreat. So I think there's a clear signal that we want to do more in the Commonwealth, and we find countries like the UK and, of course, others ideal partners so that we can all work together for mutual benefit. Specifically, I'd like to mention that we have stepped up, we have doubled our contribution to the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation from 1 million to 2 million pounds. We've stepped up our contribution to the small states offices, in fact, more than doubled both small states offices for the Commonwealth countries in New York and in Geneva. We've created a Commonwealth sub-window of fund for the, under the umbrella of the India-UN Partnership Fund. So there are a lot of initiatives that were announced by the Prime Minister. We've also, are a member, we've paid 2.5 million out of the $5 million raised for the trade financing facility for small states of the Commonwealth, which is based in Malta. We've also announced an interesting venture, and those of you who like cricket, we are going to offer training for 30 boys and girls under the age of 16 in our cricket academies in India. That's something that I know a lot of the Commonwealth countries share, the passion for cricket. And apart from that, we've also offered capacity building to Commonwealth states on the broader theme of the Blue Charter, which was adopted at the recently concluded CHOGM, capacity building through our National Institute of Oceanography in Goa. So these are the broad initiatives that we've announced, the Prime Minister announced during this CHOGM. But our desire, of course, is to step up our engagement, particularly on the economic side. I mean, the recent study, the Commonwealth Secretariat pointed out that by 2020, they expect that intra-Commonwealth trade will grow to about $1 trillion and investments to about 700 million. And this was based on the very strong role played by India and continues to play in terms of driving up intra-Commonwealth trade and investment.
I wish you mentioned trade. We've heard quite a lot about that topic through the day, and in fact, this afternoon's session was kicked off by Liam Fox talking about global Britain. So the value of bilateral trade between the UK and India is something like 19 billion pounds. It's 10 to 15% off its peak values, and neither country ranks in the top 10 for each other's trade, which is a bit surprising, particularly as in terms of investment flows between the two countries, it's been much more robust. And India has consistently been a top 5 investor in the UK and vice versa. You recently said that India is not in a rush to conclude a UK-India trade deal, and in fact you explained that India only has 9 bilateral free trade agreements, mainly with ASEAN countries. So should we hold our breath for a UK-India FTA?
Jitesh, I better answer that question very carefully, otherwise tomorrow's papers would have headlines that would be totally misleading. Actually, you know that this was an interview I'd given where somebody asked me, the interviewer, whether India was in a rush to sign an FTA with the UK or whether it would like the right deal. So my answer to that was that India was in no rush to sign the FTA, and both India and UK would like the best deal possible. So obviously you can see how they juxtapose the answer, and then so what I would like to say that leading off from the discussions between our two prime ministers, I think both sides have expressed and reiterated the political will to arrive at a free trade agreement. I wouldn't like to speculate on the timelines or a time frame because that would be unfair. We already have made some progress because a joint working group was set up and Prime Minister May went to India in November 16. That working group has met quite often, and in fact, in January, when our Commerce and Industry Minister was here to meet with Dr. Liam Fox, both sides submitted a joint trade review, which was very positive because it identified areas where we could do more. Yes, you're right about the current levels of trade, a bit underwhelming, I think. $19 billion is not a very big amount, considering the potential that both countries have. I'm happy to report that at least on services, we're doing quite well. We have about $7 billion worth services trade and quite balanced. But I think there is potential to do more, and I'm confident that, with the sort of guidance being provided by the political leadership on both sides, the active involvement of our industry, and so many fora and mechanisms. And for instance, we had the India-UK CEOs Forum that met and then submitted a report to both the Prime Ministers, who in fact responded to the suggestions being made by either side. So I'm quite hopeful that, that there will be progress. In fact, during the visit, it was decided that the India-UK third country agreements would be transitioned onto the UK and implemented during the implementation period. And after that, we would try and replicate as many of these agreements that India has with the EU, with the UK. So there has been progress already. I think there's still a long way to go, but I'm sure our negotiators, as and when they meet again, would move this discussion forward. But again, I'd like to say that I don't want to put a time frame or a timeline on it.
We often focus on trading goods, and I know that Prime Minister Modi is keen to promote his flagship Make in India program, and in fact the UK similarly in its industrial strategy emphasizes advanced manufacturing. But the reality, and I think you acknowledged it, that services accounts for well over half of Indian GDP, and that ratio extends to 80% for the UK. So is trade in physical goods a bit of a red herring, and should we really focus on services, which I think throws up its own challenges too?
You're right. I mean, the services contribute hugely as far as UK GDP is concerned, and about half of our GDP. So obviously it's a very important sector, but we can't neglect trade in goods also. But I think we have to see the total picture. You mentioned investments, because investments are particularly important. The UK companies have been major investors into India. If I remember correctly, about $24 billion since 2000. And till recently, the largest G20 investor into India. I believe it's been just recently overtaken marginally by Japan. But be that as it may, I think it's a very important relationship. And similarly, Indian companies, 800 Indian or Indian-owned companies invest in the UK, creating 110,000 jobs. And they are the third largest, Indian companies are the third largest investor into the UK and the second largest foreign job creator. So obviously this is a very dynamic relationship, a cross-cutting relationship, which I think will only further strengthen with the meetings at the highest level. And that's why it was important that 2 days before Chogam, there was this 1 day of intense bilateral meetings. The Prime Minister, of course, Prime Minister May and Prime Minister Modi met at the Downing Street in the morning, but they also met at the Crick Institute, the Francis Crick Institute in the afternoon, a very symbolic location indicating or underlining our very good partnership on science and technology, innovation, research, and issues like artificial intelligence and digital healthcare. I mean, there have been agreements signed, 10 MOUs and agreements signed during the visit, and some of them are very significant on scaling up skill development, on artificial intelligence and technologies, on healthcare, because that's extremely important for India. We have this aspirational districts program in India where the UK is going to be partnering us. I already mentioned the tech hub. The Newton Bhabha Fund will be giving awards to for amount of about £400 million by 2021. So these are very ambitious targets, and I think we are already working very closely in these areas, and I'm sure that after this visit, this will be further stepped up.
Moving on to India's reform programs, we've seen a number of bold moves from the Indian government, like demonetization and the implementation of the goods and services tax, which creates a common market amongst India's 29 states and also helpfully expands the tax base. But the India reform story isn't new. I remember joining the city as a graduate to work here in a merchant bank in 1991 when India's reforms were first heralded. So many in this audience have heard it all before and might take a more jaded view, and there's a perceived gap amongst international investors between India's potential and the delivery on the ground. How can you persuade the skeptics that it's different this time round?
Jitesh, I don't think I need to persuade the skeptics because the statistics speak for themselves. India is the largest recipient of greenfield FDI in the world. In fact, since this government came to power 3 years ago, over $210 billion worth of investments, FDI, has flowed into India. So I think there already is this business confidence in India. And in fact, there is this sort of misperception that India is closed. India is certainly not closed to investment. In fact, we are among the most open economies. There are very few sectors where there is not automatic FDI permitted. Just recently, the government opened up the single brand retail sector. So I think there is this misnomer that there are barriers. Of course, there is another problem which we've acknowledged, and that is ease of doing business. And even there, we've made substantial progress, having jumped 30 places in the World Bank index of ease of doing business. In fact, we have an MOU with the UK when Prime Minister May went there on the ease of doing business. So I think we are learning from you, and surely we'll catch up, not only in overtaking your GDP, but also catching up on the ease of doing business. But having said that, I think this relationship that we have, and the very fact that companies like, and I don't want to single out companies, but companies like JCB have such a successful business model in India, which includes exports to third countries in the region and beyond the region, as well as companies like BAE Systems, who've been there for many years and participated and are participating in the government's Make in India program. So this cooperation, whether it's on skills development, whether it's the Make in India program, whether it's startups, because a lot is being done on startups, whether it's even the Clean Ganges program. We just signed an MOU on cleaning the Ganga River when the Prime Minister's visit. So as I said, this cooperation extends across the board. And I think wherever there are issues, the India-UK CEOs Forum, for instance, comes up with recommendations, and both the governments act on those recommendations as much as they can, obviously, given the existing environment and the constraints that both sides face. But I think we are fast catching up in terms of facilitating not just investments into India, but also trade and the larger economic engagement.
I think you're quite right to highlight JCB. Lord Bamford is a colleague of mine in the House of Lords, and also we sit on the UK-India CEO Forum together. And in fact, he did highlight himself last week when we met that JCB next year will celebrate 40 years in India. and now has 5 factories, employs thousands of people, and uses India as an export hub. So that actually is definitely a poster child for what can be achieved. I just wanted to shift the focus to infrastructure and how it's funded. India has a very clear and large need for investment, approaching $1 trillion over the next 5 years. The World Bank estimates that India has an investment gap of about 10% of GDP, and there are large pools of global capital and expertise in this space, no doubt represented also in this room today, and where the City of London is ideally positioned to help India access. And indeed, London has already captured 75% market share in offshore rupee bonds, the so-called masala bonds, where there are currently 24 bonds valued at $5 billion. High Commissioner, how do you see this financing partnership between India and the City of London and the UK developing, and what are the other areas where London and India can collaborate?
If I had to answer your question in 2 words, I'd say hugely successful, because that's one area where we've made tremendous progress. In the last 2 years, for instance, Indian companies have raised, if I remember correctly, $4.9 billion in the London Stock Exchange in these masala bonds. I think 23 or 24 rupee-denominated bonds and 9 US dollar denominated bonds. And I think Indian companies obviously find London very attractive in terms of raising capital. And I think when our Prime Ministers met, my Prime Minister did underline the fact that London will continue to be among the most important global financial centers in the world. So I think we have this very good relationship with the City of London and the London Stock Exchange. During the visit, the Green Growth Equity Fund was launched, and for infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, and projects, green projects in the infrastructure field. You're right that we need a huge amount of investment in infrastructure. UK is partnering with us. We have the National Infrastructure Fund. This Green Growth Equity Fund would be part of that. So I think there is a lot that is already happening. In terms of smart cities, for instance, the UK is partnering us in building a smart city in Amravati and in Pune in India. Amravati, as you know, is the new capital of the state of Andhra Pradesh. So I think there are huge opportunities there, and I think UK companies could take advantage of this sort of push towards building up India's infrastructure.
Conscious of time, and I think our 25 minutes are almost up, so I just wanted to end by touching on the changing face of Indian geopolitics with one last question. Prime Minister Modi has been prolific in his global outreach, and there is a procession of heads of state and government visiting Delhi. It does appear, though, that other nations and regions like Japan or the ASEAN countries or the US or increasingly Israel are within Prime Minister Modi's innermost circle of close allies. How important is the UK to India?
That's it's not a difficult question to answer. I'd say very important, but I think I would like to clarify that, we, in our foreign policy, are reaching out to everyone, really, and the countries that you mentioned, certainly, but beyond that, too. For instance, later this week, the Prime Minister will be going to China for an informal summit with President Xi. Extremely important relationship for us. Similarly, I mean, our relationship with Africa, our relationship in the developing world, been of long-standing, and we've had very close relations. Our president has visited a large number of African countries recently. So we have this relationships that have been forged over decades, and some relationships that are being strengthened now. So I think I would say that the UK stands very high on our priorities simply because you mentioned when we began this talk that about our shared history. But beyond that, I mean, the shared history is obviously a good foundation, but the modern relationship can't last only on shared history. So I think the sinews of our modern relationship are basically being built up with the sort of cooperation that I described earlier. So I think the India-UK partnership is extremely important. The very fact that the Prime Minister has made a second trip to the UK within 3 years, and the Prime Minister May's first trip outside Europe, a bilateral trip at least, was to India, are pointers in that direction, that both countries regard each other as very important strategic partners.
Thank you, High Commissioner, and thank you for being so open and candid. Please thank the Indian High Commissioner.